Thanks for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we are listener-sponsored and commercial-free, but there still are bills to pay. In order to raise some needed funds to cover the cost, our station is offering a silver special. In the continental United States for a $60 donation, or in Alaska, Hawaii, or Canada for a $70 donation, we will send you an uncirculated 2018 1-ounce pure silver Eagle. The $70 donation, the extra 10 is to cover shipping, by the way, outside of the continental United States. When making the donation, you must put Silver Eagle promo in the notes on the donation. And thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at revolution.radio and freedomslips.com. Without you, there is no us. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Do you or someone you know suffer from poor circulation, shortness of breath, or chest pains? Are you looking for a more natural solution to help overcome these problems? People tell us that after just a few months taking Extendivite, their doctors have noticed unexplainable improvements in their overall health. For more information, visit heartdrop.com or call 1-877-928-8822.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
And tell them Nighthawk sent you, because if you call this number and tell them Nighthawk sent you, you'll get $5 off your first order at extendivite.com. Thank you. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Bennett and Michael J. Showgames here, coming to you on Friday, January 11th, 2019. And we're going to continue our series examining the 9/11 truth memos and having the individual authors come along and telling their stories. And Michael J., you and I were doing some interviews, and we'll keep a lot of that quiet, specifically what's going to be happening next week. But what we can talk about today was the enormous attention that's being drawn by international media, Russian television, press TV, RT, Sputnik, BBC, International France News. Every news channel is beginning to examine and question the wall and the presidential conflict with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. And I was on doing an interview this morning, as you know, and it's fascinating to explain to international media just how simple this whole issue is. It comes right down to the American people are making a decision to protect their children and their property and their parents and their families and their dogs and their cats and their cars and their swing sets and everything from being abused, stolen, raped, pillaged, killed by building a wall, a barrier, a fence. It's that simple. It's nothing to do with ethnocentric thinking or xenophobic prejudice or racial bias or bigoted hatred or any of the nonsense talking points that the fascist leftist Democrats are trying to regurgitate into the public sphere. It's got nothing to do with any of that nonsense. It's got everything to do with the United States of America is owned and controlled absolutely unequivocally by the American citizenry. The citizens of the United States own this country, not non-citizens, certainly not invaders, certainly not illegal immigrants, certainly not asylum seekers. The citizenry own this country. The citizenry determine the laws. The citizenry define who comes here and who doesn't. Not a bunch of savage leftist lunatics who are self-flagellating and full of self-deprecation out of political correctness and white guilt. We don't subscribe to that. So it's interesting, and I'm going to hand it to you, Michael J., to talk about this while we bring in one of our guests. Go ahead, Michael J.
Thank you, Scott. We're in agreement that the wall is about national sovereignty.
Can't hear you, Sal. I think you're still on mute.
Actually, I'm not. Can you hear me yet? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me, Scott? Can you hear me? Scott? Can you hear me, Scott? Scott, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Scott? Scott, can you hear me? I can't hear you either. That's amazing. This is amazing. Scott, can you hear me? Well, I can't hear you, Scott, and I'm going to try to drop off and come back.
I hear you now. Go ahead. You're on.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. Thank you. This wall that President Trump wants to build, this was a very important part of his contract with America, his agreement to start reversing the deep state corruption that had been brought in under the Clintons in the 90s with the NAFTA and GATT and things like that. And they brought in all sorts of things that sent our industries overseas. They were working for the globalists. They were working for the New World Order, and they did so much damage. It cost America literally trillions of dollars with respect to what they did in reversing what generations of America had built up, and then it was sold out from under them and sent over to China and Mexico and places like that. But this wall is something that causes all sorts of mixed feelings concerning the whole globalist goal over in the EU, because they don't believe in borders anymore. They don't believe in barriers. What was that about? This is weird, isn't it? Are you? Did we get somebody on the air just now? This is Michael J. Who did you bring on board, Scott? Hello?
All right. Yeah, we've got Greg Felton. I think Greg's with us. Greg,
okay.
Are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Well, Greg, we were just doing an introduction. Michael J. and I were talking about the wall and the presidency and the political affairs that we see going on now with the conflicts and stuff like that. So before, well, if you want to jump in and make any comments about that, feel free to go ahead. But I just wanted to also open it up so you can comment on your chapter, the book that you wrote for the 9/11 Truth Memos. But feel free if you wanted to comment on this subject before we jump into your material. Go ahead.
Yeah, I followed somewhat this wall issue, and I'm just amazed at how idiotic President Trump is behaving. Not only is it completely without merit, given the fact that the people coming from Mexico are doing so legally, through legal immigration, not through illegal means, but it is such a waste of manpower, such a waste of material, and it makes the United States look as narrow-minded and fearful as the Soviet Union was when it put up the Berlin Wall.
I don't agree with you, brother. My name is Michael J. You haven't met me yet. And I wasn't a part of the 9/11 thing, but I'm a veteran and took an oath along with my brother, Scott Bennett. I don't believe that we have a lot of agreement in this area. I'd certainly like to encourage you to talk about the 9/11 issue, because that was a crime against humanity, but it wasn't under Trump. It was under some sociopaths like Dick Cheney and Bush and it was facilitated and continued under Obama. But the reality is both Scott and I really believe in what President Trump is doing, and we don't use this broadcast to cast him down and his positions, because we both voted for him. So please respond.
Okay, I can appreciate you voted for him. But as I say, I have not seen a rational defense of putting up a wall against Mexico. It seems to me that this is a very silly and very badly considered idea that now Trump is now being forced to make good on because he's backed himself into a corner. This is.
Are you a Democrat, brother? Are you
Pardon?
a Democrat?
I'm not anything. I'm a Canadian.
Oh, a Canadian. Well, please, brother, talk about Canada. We're not asking for a wall between Canada and America, but the issue is the people down on the border just said that they stopped people from 130 other nations that were trying to come in, not just from Mexico. And a lot of these people, they're trying to come in illegally. And the reality is we do have portals for people coming in legally, but you have to get, in the back of the line. I mean, if these people were so, wanting to be in a lawful place instead of a place of tyranny, they wouldn't be trying to come into America so they could, take advantage of the benefits here. But let's, you're a Canadian, stick with Canada. But right now, what we're looking at is the fact that Canadians were also involved in going over to Iraq in that horrendous operation where Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and Canadians lost their lives. And the reality is we're talking about a crime against humanity. We call it, Scott and I call it the terror wars, because we caused terror and destruction for millions of people in the Middle East, all based on a lie. So what was your perspective, brother, on what happened on 9/11 and the lies that were told about it?
Well, the September 11th attack on the Trade Center and the Pentagon was essentially designed to give justification to the Patriot Act, which was written 3 weeks before the event happened. It is not possible to look at the September the 11th attack as an isolated event. It has to be, in my view, looked at in the context of a larger geopolitical objective, and that is the demonization of Muslims and the rationalization of Israeli imperial aggression throughout the Middle East and Israeli control over the United States. In August of 2001, Philip Zelikow, who was the official mythmaker of the Bush government, which I call the Cheney government to all intents and purposes, had a draft of the memo, of the report. And when the attack came out, can you imagine a doorstop of a book like that act being prepared in the span of only a few weeks? No. So what we had there was essentially a very elaborate show where you had airplanes being used as props in a plan that had long been in the works to bring down the World Trade Centers and blame it on Muslims. So
we agree with you, brother.
Pardon?
We agree with you. Thank you. Go on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Greg. I want to hear.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. I can stop there as an introduction, and I can entertain any comments or questions.
No. I wanted to read your chapter and make, because people who are listening to this have read the book, the 9/11 Truth Memos. They're familiar with all the authors. So I wanted you both to come on and give any new information and the commentary and analysis that you may have developed in your whole experience in digesting the 9/11 issue, which didn't happen for me till much, much later, after I'd already been in the military, after I'd been thrown in prison by the Obama administration for all sorts of political imprisonment issues. I didn't discover it till far, far later. But I want people to be able to go right to page 77, and that is Greg Felton's 9/11 Zionism Great Feeding Frenzy, The Parasite Eats the Host. And I think it's fascinating. So I'm just going to read a few of this and jump in and stop me anywhere you want.
Okay.
And you sent this to the president, as we all did, and you write, Mr. President, The Host and the Parasite, How Israel's Fifth Column Consumed America is a meticulously researched chronicle of the U.S. Tragic slide from an independent republic into a client state of Israel, a shishka in the vernacular you know so well. This degeneration occurred over the last 50 years in full view of the American public and with the active complicity of American lawmakers. The Zionization of America, a period of progressive subservience to Israel, began when President Harry Truman took a $2 million bribe to support the creation of the State of Israel so he could appeal to Jewish voters during the 1948 election, which he was expected to lose heavily. From this act, the Israeli lobby got its hooks into the U.S. government and made it complicit in the illegal Zionist occupation of Palestine and the murder as well as the dispossession of its native inhabitants.
Yeah, at that point, Thomas Dewey, who was the governor of New York, he was a Republican candidate, he had sewn up the New York Jewish vote. And Harry Truman was headed for a massive defeat. And when asked afterwards, Harry Truman said, "I have 100,000 Jews in my constituency. I do not have 100,000 Arabs." So he admitted that he was bribed, effectively. He admitted that his vote was dishonest. And what's even more interesting, I think this is in the book as well, that the creation of Israel was never legitimate and it never happened. The partition plan of November 29th, 1947 was coerced because three nations who were planning to vote against partition were blackmailed into supporting it, because United States senators and congressmen doing Israel's dirty work threatened to remove all manner of Marshall Plan aid to them if they voted against Israel. And what's even more corrupt is that the United Nations had no authority to create Israel, because it was taking land from Palestine to give it to a group of Europeans who had no claim to that land whatsoever. So on two counts, the partition plan of 1947 was illegal and unethical and immoral, and frankly could not exist. And the fact, and this is most important, the fact it was never ratified by the Security Council on Harry Truman's orders means that it was never enacted, which means that it does not exist. Because General Assembly resolutions are merely recommendations for policy, unless all parties to a GA resolution agree to be bound by its terms. And clearly that did not apply to the partition plan. So effectively, Israel has no legitimate foundation. And that is why.
Yeah, it's
brother, I've never heard that before. That is amazing, brother. I've never heard this before.
Yeah, let me continue reading it. Subsequent stages of Zionization would see the U.S. increasingly provide political and diplomatic cover for Israeli atrocities and even commit unprovoked aggression for Israel in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, contrary to the national interest in U.S. law. There is no rational explanation for the U.S. government acting against its own national interests unless one recognizes that the Israeli lobby effectively controls the U.S. and has forced its leaders to betray themselves to serve a foreign interest. The most heinous instance was U.S. acquiescence in the premeditated Israeli attack on the USS Liberty. The Johnson administration, as well as every other president since, has protected Israel by classifying the attack as an incident and threatening survivors with prison and loss of pension if they speak out.
Accident.
Yeah. Others have documented the specifics of the Zionist occupation of America. This is the big picture. Israeli parasitism plays itself out in various aspects of U.S. political culture. First, in the rise of the neoconservative movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in which the Zionists use money and propaganda to co-opt evangelical Christians who share a common illiberality and opposition to the Great Society movement of the 1960s. This counter-revolution would reach fruition with the election of Ronald Reagan, from which the descent into fascism can most reliably be dated.
In fact, to pick up that one point, 1973 appears to be a very key year for this, because 73 was just toward the end of the Great Society movement, and it was the waning years of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War would end the next year in April. And 1973 saw the passage of the Roe versus Wade decision, which decriminalized abortion, which was an important step for the Great Society movement. But it also saw the creation of the very first so-called conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, under Paul Weyrich. And it's from this point that we can see a conservative counter-revolution take place. This was the time when corporations and big money realized that unless they did something, they were going to lose their control over the United States because the populist movement had become very, very successful. So from 1973 through into 1980, the right wing in the country, to use that term, led by ultra, believe it or not, left-wing economists like the neo-Trotskyite Jewish economists like Norman Podhoretz and other names who escape me at the moment. These are the people who founded or would found the fundamental basis of the neo-fascism that we see in the United States today. The victory of Gerald Ford by a whisker over Jimmy Carter in the 1976 federal election. Sorry, pardon me, I got that backwards. The victory of Jimmy Carter over Gerald Ford in the 76 election signaled the rise to prominence of the religious right. Jimmy Carter is a Baptist, and from this point forward, Americans who were devoutly Christian could proclaim their religiosity without fear of backlash, because now it was trendy to be Christian and American. And from Jimmy Carter until the rise of Ronald Reagan, America went through a very severe period of unfortunate events. And Ronald Reagan played up on this, and as you know, there was a lot of illegal backstabbing behind Carter called the October Surprise, when the Republicans were doing dirty tricks with the Iranians to get the 444 hostages out of Tehran.
Yes.
And for that reason, Ronald Reagan should have been charged with treason. At any rate, to make a long story even longer, as Steve Allen used to say, 73 was the beginning of the slide into fascism, what I call the proto-fascist era. And that begins really with Ronald Reagan, because Reagan allowed Zionist Jews by the bucket load into government, although not into cabinet positions. And later on, we would see the period of 1981 to about 88, 89 to be a consolidation phase for the Zionists, because by the time his vice president, George Bush, became president, it was almost too late to do anything about it. The Zionists had essentially proliferated like a cancer throughout the American government, the Pentagon, and other agencies of the U.S. and state governments. So 73 is a key year to date the beginning of the end of the illusion of democracy in the United States.
Yeah. Well, you know, on one interesting note, I worked at the Heritage Foundation when I was in Washington from I was there from 2003 to 2005. I think I was at Heritage when I was doing my doctorate. So you're right. Paul Weyrich created it, and there were a lot of good social science side people that I focused with, but there were a lot of national security Zionist types that I didn't realize how bad they were till much, much later. But just full disclosure, I worked at the Heritage Foundation.
Okay.
And I went and visited Paul Weyrich when he also created the Free Congress Foundation. He had left, and Ed Fulner, who started it with him too, they split ways, and he created the Free Congress Foundation, and they, just think tanks sprout up and die away right and left. But Heritage is a force to be reckoned with. Go ahead.
I have a section in my book about the think tanks, because the Zionist movement corrupted or started a lot of think tanks. Yeah. For example, the American Enterprise, American Enterprise Institute.
Yeah.
Used to be a standard sort of minimalist, conservative think tank. Yeah. Then it got co-opted, and it became a Zionist farm team for the federal government.
Yeah.
It became part of the revolving door. And one of them, the Free Congress Foundation, WINEP, JINSA, the Center for, there's a whole alphabet soup of them.
Sure.
And they proliferated throughout the 1980s.
Well, we remember Bill Kristol. His father was a CIA asset in the 50s and the 60s that was engaged in Operation Gladio and all sorts of European PSYOP operations, against the Russia. So you're right, the Neo Kristol, in particular, Bill Kristol. I remember I've shared it before. A book one of my professors had written when I was doing my doctorate. Klaus Rinn wrote America the Virtuous, and it's still available, but it was written in 2003, and it was essentially saying how the neocons, and within that with the Zionists, were pushing us towards this war in 2003 that would have the worst consequences you could imagine, and it's been prophetically accurate.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I call Irving Kristol was the godfather of the neocon movement, and he was actually brought down to Washington, D.C. to sort of jumpstart this whole thing. It was from him that a lot of this sprouted.
Yes.
There's a groups called the Bradley Foundation, the Olin Foundation, Sarah Scaife, Carthage, the Scaife family, Smith Robinson, and Castle Rock. Those are just some of the funders for these horrible treasonous outfits.
Let me continue, because you mentioned this in this part of the book. It's quite good. You write, second is the mutation or creation of, quote, think tanks, like the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, which provide a steady stream of Zionist propaganda and a revolving door of loyal government servants to formulate policy for Israel. Yeah. Third, the invention under Bill Clinton of the great boogeyman, quote, Islamic terrorism, unquote, and Osama bin Laden as its great devil figure, but was both designed to justify U.S. aggression against Afghanistan and Iraq, serve Israel's demonization of not only Palestinians and Arabs, but now Muslims as a whole.
Now, I'm going to stop there for 1 second. The reason this is important is that Israel is a bit like Israeli propaganda, and its aggression is a bit like an onion. Originally, it was just focused on Palestinians, murdering them, stealing their property, and taking their land. Yeah. And after a while, that seemed to be inadequate, because the Palestinians are quite resilient, even though they're grossly outnumbered, outmanned, and outgunned. So later on, Israel turned its guns not only on Palestinians, but on Arabs in general. Not only they're going after them, but the Arab states that help them, like Iraq. Saddam Hussein was an extremely powerful supporter of Palestine. And that's one of the reasons that he had to be removed from power. Saddam Hussein was not as bad as people make him out to be. He was essentially a garden variety dictator, but he had a certain respect for the Palestinians. But after that, the Arabs themselves, you only could go so far. Then Israel decided to ratchet it up one more notch. So instead of targeting Palestinians and then Arabs, they started targeting the religion, Islam. And because of that, the whole world now associates Islam with terrorism, which is grossly unjustified.
Right.
But it shows the degree to which Zionists have co-opted and perverted our political discourse.
Yeah.
So this is why it's important that these think tanks, and the people that they produce get into government, tell the president what to think and what to do. Yeah. And this is why we have the condition we have. As a matter of fact, before Bill Clinton took office, he signed, without being president, mind you, a document promising a fixed number of billions of dollars in aid to Israel. And he was presented with a list of people to put into government positions. Mm-hmm. What people don't realize is that the presidents, when they nominate people to become secretaries of state or whatnot, they don't make the decision. They're given choices. They're given people to do. The decisions are made for them.
Mm-hmm. Sadly, and in violation of the Constitution, of course. So we continue. Fourth, the abject subservience of the U.S. to Israel is clearly seen in how Israelis are allowed to bypass security protocols to have free run of the Pentagon. If Israelis act as if they own the place, it's because they do.
And that's chapter 10.
Yeah. Fifth, the climax of Zionist hegemony came in 2001 with the false flag attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, attacks that could not have been carried out or covered up without the active complicity of, among others, the vice president and the directors of the CIA and FBI. The complicity of the media, the fake news media as you label it, was another factor in this Zionist atrocity not being fully exposed. The host and the parasite leaves no doubt that Israel and the George W. Bush junta were responsible. Junta is used throughout the book to highlight illegitimacy of Bush's election and the fact that those in his administration committed a coup d'etat against the Constitution. This book shows that the U.S. Patriot Act was drafted before, not after, the September 11th attack, meaning that it was planned well in advance and the September 11th attack was just a means to a pre-established end, turning the U.S. into a police state to censor pro-Palestinian political thought and previous public opposition to a global war based on lies. The only beneficiaries of the invented, quote, war on terror, unquote, is the invented state of Israel and the U.S. military-industrial intelligence complex. Sixth, interspersed throughout the book is the history of petropolitics in Afghanistan and how the hypocrisy of the U.S. led to the bombing of that country, not over anything to do with September 11th attack, but because the Taliban government would not support the U.S. Saudi-led consortium's bid to build a pipeline across the country, was invaded and bombed. The Host and the Parasite is the first comprehensive analysis of the self-inflicted death of the U.S., an essential reading for any president who might wish to turn against the deep state and its Zionist underbelly, as President Vladimir Putin has. This book could be useful, could be helpful in developing an educational series for the public, perhaps offered within a new Trump channel that uses the truth about 9/11 as a catalyst for terminating Zionist influence over the U.S. economy, government, media, both mainstream and social, and society, Hollywood, and Christian Zionists. Mr. President, all of us would benefit from your leadership in getting to the bottom of what happened on 9/11, who did it, how, why, and at what cost to all of us and our future generations. Please count on me as a staunch supporter, ready to assist you in any way possible as you lead us all toward a brighter future rooted in truth. Very respectfully, Greg Felton. And I'll do the references here. Greg Felton, his book is called The Host and the Parasite, How Israel's Fifth Column Consumed America, 3rd edition, from Money Tree Publishing, 2017. And Greg's website is thehostandtheparasite.com. And this is on page 77 of the 9/11 Truth Memos. So that's a very excellent, succinct chapter, Greg. I think you really begin to expose something. We've talked about this. We're in agreement with you on this subject, the Zionist infiltration. I lived it and saw it when I was at Heritage, and when I was in the Bush administration, and when I was in the State Department, and when I was in the military. I saw all of them. I was walking through a zoo, if you will, and I looked in all these exhibits and saw what you're describing. And it's been a surreal experience for me. And then 9/11 came later. But I'm going to hand it back to you to comment on what you want about this. There's so many things we could talk about. Mike and I were military officers. We took an oath. I don't know if you were, but this strikes me as an act of treason and war that every military officer, past, present, and future, have a duty to their oath to the Constitution to stand up and expose this and attack all those who participated in this and prosecute and demand that members of Congress act on this. This is a declaration of war on September 11, 2001 by domestic enemies of the United States. And they will never be anything other than domestic enemies. And your work helps illuminate this and take the president down a path of correcting the greatest crime in the history of civilization. So I'll hand it back to you, Greg.
Oh, well, thanks very much. That's quite a very impressive buildup. It's interesting that you mentioned that you saw the Zionization of America firsthand in your various posts within government. And that made me think about how many other people saw what you saw. I'm imagining that of all the people who work in the federal government, perhaps over the last, 40, 50 years, millions of them have seen the sort of things that you've seen, and yet nothing's been done about it.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting here is that in my book, toward the end of it, and it has to do with this as well, it's important to recognize that we cannot pretend we live in a democracy or even a rational world. See, I lived in Russia in 1979. I was a student of Russian language.
Ah, very good.
Yeah, I speak the language fluently, and I was actually arrested by the KGB when I was there on a mistaken identity charge. It's kind of a funny story. But the upshot is that I saw Russians, and when I saw them on the street or in shops, and they would behave in a very correct, very neutral manner. When we got behind closed doors at their homes and so forth, they were very friendly, very outgoing, and very engaging. See, the Russians knew that they were being watched 24 hours a day. They knew that they were under surveillance. They couldn't associate with foreigners. They couldn't say things that were unacceptable to the government. So they had a public face and a private face. So I saw how people lived under a police state, because pretty much that's what the Soviet Union was.
Yeah.
So left-leaning police state. And I look at the United States of America, and I see places like Los Angeles, which has 24-hour surveillance over the whole city. There are cameras everywhere. There are people who follow people on the internet, and they will persecute them if they say something wrong. They can be banned from Facebook, or they're banned on Twitter or whatever if saying something pejorative about the Holocaust or calling into question the 6 million figure, for example. We live in a society that is not free. We live in a police state, and we have to think like people in a police state. We have to realize that we are not free and that we cannot expect things to happen the way they ought to happen. Logically speaking, every American should be marching on Washington, D.C. by the millions, carrying pitchforks or whatever, and demanding the resignation of the government.
Yeah.
And the imprisonment of I don't know how many thousand people who are literally Israeli fifth columns in the American government. But this has not happened. And one of the tragedies of democracies that America used to be is that when it turns tyrannical, it becomes the most pervasive and virulent form of tyranny, because the public becomes its own enslavers. The public is easily distracted by things like video games or reality television or sports or whatnot. And Americans are right now, I think, living a life that is much more impoverished than it was 50 years ago.
Yes.
They do not have the same economic freedom. They live in fear of bankruptcy, like most Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And so without economic freedom, without economic freedom, there can be no real political freedom. And Americans are going through life almost, I think, I would submit, in a kind of a fog. They're going through the motions of being citizens, but they know they're not citizens. Jimmy Carter is one of the best minds ever to be a president, and he had a great statement the other day. America is an oligarchy.
Yeah.
And he's right. And he sees what's going on. You and I and a few others see what's going on. But the average American, especially the average poor American, that could be poor, white, black, whatever, they can't afford to act the way their conscience tells them. So Americans are going to self-censor themselves. They're going to allow themselves to be treated like sheep because they can't risk the surveillance state coming down on them like a ton of bricks.
And see, isn't that the eternal crisis, the eternal human nexus that we find ourselves as human beings confronted with, this a rite of passage, this moment of transfiguration where we choose to sell our birthright for the pottage. We choose 30 pieces of silver and a pension and a boat and a house and a football game, season tickets, and all of the pornography and luxury and intoxications that perhaps this world of pleasures artificially promises. We have a choice for all of that stuff and materialism and hedonism and the blindness and the self-lobotomization that mandates and comes with it, or we choose to stand in the sunlight of truth and fresh air before our God and speak our souls, speak what we are inspired with, speak the truth in righteous indignation, in fearless love, in absolute uncompromising terms, to throw out for all who have ears to hear and eyes to see, to behold what we have experienced, what we've seen, what we've processed, and damn the torpedoes, and give it, gold or silver I have not, but what I have I give unto you. That seems to be the moment of separating the sheep and the goats that we're approaching as a society, because we're on this cusp. We're on the police state. We're on the cusp of a civil war. We're on the cusp of an absolute meltdown into schizophrenia. We've got Antifa lunatic kids who don't know if they're a man or a woman or a boy or a girl or a dog. Or they don't know human sexuality or marriage. They don't have any concept of God. They have this entitlement mentality. We really are a schizophrenic society. And we have, those of us who aren't, are trying to wake people up to say, choose the road of combat, choose the road of fighting, choose the road of truth, and discard all of this materialism. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. People who engage in distractions, I don't think that these people are necessarily stupid. I think they do so as a way to relieve themselves of the misery of what they see around them. I mean, a lot of people are simply afraid. See, a bully is only as strong as the power that his victim gives it. Most bullies are not very big. They just project an image that's much larger than themselves. And so a lot of people are afraid to stand up. France, for example, recently has had a nice little march in Paris from the Yellow Vests who are actively asking people to take all their money out of the banks to bring the economy to its knees, which I think is a great idea. The French have a strong revolutionary spirit that has not been silenced by the Israelis. America is a special case because the Israeli lobby here is so much more virulent than any other country. But the French, they have the right idea, and we have to use the French here as an example in a reversal of history. Let the French Revolution today be an inspiration for the American one.
Amen. We need to storm the Bastille and liberate the Americans.
The other thing is, I'm not so sure that invoking God is very helpful here. This is not simply a matter of a religious mentality versus a non-religious mentality. It's a case of simply fear. And people who either believe in religion or don't, they can find common cause.
Right. Amen. I agree with you.
Americans need to realize that they have nothing left to lose.
Yes.
See, a person who feels like he has something to lose, like a mortgage or a job or an education, will temper his conscience to bring him into line with with an expected behavior.
Yes.
Now, right now, Americans they're not living as well as they did in the 60s and 70s, but at least they are living. Unfortunately, and I hope this is wrong, but it may have to get a lot worse before it gets better.
Well, see, that's it.
Americans are going to have to feel the lack of food, the lack of shelter, the lack of employment. And when this happens, Americans are going to decide that enough is enough. And the only point at this, whether the thing to consider here is whether the police state is so pervasive that it can withstand a popular revolution. And this is something we don't know, because if places like Boston, for example, have a militarized police force. I mean, the posse comitatus rule appears to be being whittled away bit by bit. I mean, the whole purpose of the police forces is to keep civil order. It is not to wage war against American citizens. But as you saw during the Boston Marathon bombing of several years ago, there were tanks. The Boston military is like a small little armed force, and that's illegal. if I understand the Constitution.
Yeah, it is.
correctly.
It is.
And so this kind of police force is pervasive, is growing throughout the United States. Israelis are training the Americans in the art of torture,
That's right.
in the art of terrorist mentality. So long as Americans are being controlled by the Israelis, and so long as they're being bred to think like Israelis,
Yeah.
then it's going to be hard to separate the American from the Israeli. It's a bit like the Borg in the Star Trek Next Generation, where you sort of assimilate an individual into the collective and it becomes incapable of thinking for itself. Americans have to recognize that Israel is the enemy. It has never been an ally. There are no treaties with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that there are no treaties with Israel?
Well,
It's just like it's a gangster state.
Sure.
That relies on word of mouth, oral agreement, and silent consent. I mean, if you think about the founders of the United States, we look at Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and so forth. But we should think of people like John Gotti, Legs Diamond, Meyer Lansky, Al Capone. These are the people who really are the manifestations of what it means to be in America these days. America, gangsterism is essentially the business of government. And the gangsters these days are those that put the interests of Israel ahead of those of the Americans of the United States.
Brother, it's interesting that you said that, because when Scott Bennett was let out of prison he was in there for 2.5 years for filling out a housing form incorrectly. The reality is that he was sent to a halfway house where he encountered a forced lesson on him that discovered to him the program called Deep Black, which was about the association of the CIA with the Mossad in drug importation and assassination programs in America. And it's now been exposed that the CIA has been using MS-13 and other parts of the mafia and whatever for their drug distribution in America. And this is being exposed right now. So you're absolutely correct. The deep state government has been in bed with the mafia since the 40s, and they've also been involved with kidnapping, child trafficking, and creating sex slaves and assassins out of MK Ultra children up here in America and in Canada, by the way. And the reality is the truth is emerging. It's bursting out of the ground, and there's a lot of people have suffered. Many Americans have died under this deep state tyranny, and America is waking up. So I'm grateful you brought that up.
The one thing also concerns me a little bit is the general attitude of a lot of Americans toward the media, especially toward Donald Trump. Now, I'm not a big fan of Trump. I think he's a bit of an embarrassment, and I think he is the kind of person the Electoral College was designed to keep out of the presidency. And the irony is the Electoral College put him in. Having said that,
well, I'm so glad they kept that witch out, though. I'm very grateful that they didn't let that lesbian, child molesting Satanist in. So the Electoral College did a good thing. Amen?
Yeah. Okay, let's keep Satan out of this. Okay, Satan's got enough to worry about. The thing is that Trump really was not elected. Hillary Clinton was unelected. This was a protest vote against.
Right.
This was not a pro-Trump vote. A lot of people have no use for Donald Trump. And if Bernie Sanders had been the Democratic nominee, Sanders would have won a whopping majority in both houses.
Yeah.
It would have been a walk. And this is something I've written also on my website, when the Democratic National Committee, which is essentially an extension of Israel, sought to install Clinton as president, not have her legitimately elected. I
agree.
Yeah. The problem, though, is that a lot of people are piling on Donald Trump in a way that is it does a disservice to everybody.
Yeah.
Trump can be criticized for many things, and I will state he should be criticized for that wall. We can talk about that some other time.
Yeah.
But the habit of people of just dumping on politicians so quickly, so reflexively, is calling into question the integrity of even the electoral system of the United States. The United States, as I was on a show this morning, I said that the United States has become ungovernable. Because even if a president does something right, it means that the media is going to dislike it, and the media is going to caricature it as something bad. Donald Trump has done a couple of good things. One of them is he's talked about pulling the U.S. out of Syria. And no sooner had he said that than John Bolton has contradicted him publicly.
Right.
And John, which is why I call it now the Bolton administration.
Yeah.
Because Donald Trump has essentially been co-opted. He's been pushed aside. He's now a figurehead of a deep state government. And whatever good he was going to do when he got elected, because he was not a professional politician, is now questionable, because it looks like he has been either cowed into submission or he has been convinced that the likes of John Bolton are correct. Now, Bolton is a psychopath, and I have that in my book. And the man is he's a Jinsan. He's from Jinsa. He's an Israeli fifth column. He's reprehensible. And
he's never been in the military. He's never served. He's never sworn. He's a Kissinger type.
Well, that's sort of interesting. I hadn't thought of him being a Kissinger type. But the thing is, a lot of people are dumping on people reflexively. And it's a little bit concerning that Americans, it's one thing to criticize a politician, and they deserve to be criticized. But it's quite another to condemn, to mock the very institutions that people are supposed to be upholding. And this is why I think America may be ready for something different.
Well, let me jump in there, Greg, because what I see, and we've got about 9 minutes left, and I want Michael J. to also ask, but I want you to be able to close out and finalize your thoughts. But I wanted to just preface it with this. It seems like the American population, because of social stimulation, poor education, vaccines, all sorts of corrosive societal elements and teachings, and I would say a neutering and a castration of the American conservative religious church and the brainwashing lobotomy of them with Christian Zionism. We have a society of people that are on the breaking point, and you see the Antifa leftists, the most heinous victims of the left agenda, turning completely mad. There's such a violent fury permeating through the left. You see them when they surround houses of people like Tucker Carlson or Senator Cruz in a restaurant, and they shout people down. It's nothing to do with my sympathy with those people, but I do have a hatred for those who circle people in restaurants and burn pitchforks and crosses on their backyards. That's the same spirit as Antifa, and we're approaching this civil war in America that I think is going to happen before we have a turning in a more positive direction. And I'll hand it back to you to say, am I right or wrong or something in between? Go ahead.
Well, as far as Antifa and other organizations go, I mean, I do find that these are more of a problem than the people they target. One of the great failures of the left, well, let's call it the democratic movement in America, is that the people who talk about tolerance and anti-racist propaganda and so forth, these tend to be some of the most, the people who are guilty of it the most. Now, I have no use for religion, whatever. And I think the more we keep God out of this, the better, because God is a polarizing concept, especially since Christianity has been responsible for so many atrocities, especially in the United States. But what's happening is that the left wing is co-opting the obviously bombastic right wing, and it's holding itself out to be an improvement or the only salvation from the likes of Trump and the likes of Steve Bannon or Milo Yiannopoulos and the likes of them. Now, I don't want to say I agree with them, but there is this is not a zero-sum game where if you dislike one side, the other side is an improvement. What we have is a co-optation of the American mind to see that the Democratic Party is the savior of America, because it's very easy to dislike Trump because he is bombastic, he is ignorant, he is unsophisticated, crude, and he's generally not competent. And I would state, and I will go into that later, but he's such an easy target that it's very easy to look past the people who are making the accusations against him. The Charlottesville fracas last year, remember that? Well, that was staged by Antifa. That was not the fault of the Southern Americans. Now, I might have disagreements whether Robert E. Lee was a good general or not, but there was no excuse for moving the statue. That was a provocation, and that was a setup to make an event happen that looked like it was provoked by right-wing extremists and sort of white separatists or white nationalists. This is not true. But the media plays it up so well because the media is fundamentally pro-democratic.
Yeah.
And the democratic movement is the worst offender because it is the kind of people that could inspire people to rise up and do something useful for the country. Yet these are the real problems. They are the root of the Zionist control of America. These are the people who control our attitudes, to control American attitudes, to control American institutions.
I'm going to respond to you now. I'm very grateful, but we're right at the edge. I want to respond to you here. Both Scott and I do not believe in religion. We do believe in the living God, and we have a right to express our conviction that he is a righteous and a just God. What we're looking at, though, is the perversion of Christianity by cults like the cult of Lucifer in Rome and the English Catholic Church, which had a great deal of influence over in Canada and in America concerning the use of Aboriginals for sex slaves and destroying them by the thousands. The reality is this: we do know the truth. I personally know Kevin Annette. I understand what's going on concerning child sacrifice in Rome and in the deep state in America and in Canada. And the reality is that we do see that God is someone who answers prayer for those that actually can have faith in him. The unbelief that's in America has made room for a great deal of evil because unbelief, tolerance, they don't have a line that they can draw and say, you shall not murder.
No, okay, hold on. Okay,
hold on a second. This is our program. I'm saying to you,
ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
You don't have the freedom to deny God in a book. That's your problem.
Just don't want to listen? Don't have one of those fancy phones with too many buttons. Don't know what an app is? Or you don't even care? Well, we got you here at Revolution Radio. Now you can dial in 24/7 to listen to our shows. We have a number for Studio A and Studio B, and best of all, it's free. Don't forget, carrier charges for your cell phone provider may apply, though, so check with your cell provider to make sure. So ready? Here you go. Get a pen. Here's the number. Studio A is 712-432-6958, and Studio B is 716-748-0112. Thank you very much for listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the number one listener-supported radio station in the world.
I want to hear the guest. I want to allow the guest.
Hey everyone, it's Barbara Jean Lindsay, the Cosmic Oracle. If you have questions about your past lives or future plans,
you can believe whatever you want. I never said you couldn't believe in God,
career, or just
but you cannot invoke God in politics because that is a polarizing event.
The Cosmic Oracle,
God is not a provable
on Revolution
concept.
Radio at
God is merely an article of faith. And if you want to believe in God, that's fine. But you have no right to tell me what I may or may not say. It may be your show, but I'm the guest. I think you can respect me enough not to browbeat me over the head. Do you understand?
Yeah, I
Thanks
think
for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we are listener-sponsored and commercial-free, but there still are bills to pay. In order to raise some needed funds to cover the cost, our station is offering a silver special. In the continental United States for a $60 donation, or in Alaska, Hawaii, or Canada for a $70 donation, we will send you an uncirculated 2018 1-ounce pure silver eagle. The $70 donation, the extra 10 is to cover shipping, by the way, outside the United States. When making the donation, you must put Silver Eagle promo in the notes on the donation. And thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at revolution.radio and freedomslips.com. Without you, there is no us. Revolution Radio, where information
There
never
is no
sleeps.
religion. There is only a person's relationship with the creator of the universe. And the creation
Looking for a
of the
nightcap
universe
to fill your
and
listening
the
needs? Come join us on Spaced Out Radio with me, Dave Scott, right here on Revolution Radio. Monday through Friday for 3 hours a night, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern. We will take you down the supernatural path. From ET contact to the paranormal and all of the spiritual, cryptid, and conspiracy stories in between. You can find us right here on Revolution Radio, at spacedoutradio.com, on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio, and on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio Show. Spaced Out Radio. It's a night of talk and interaction.
The pursuit
Are
of
you
truth
experienced?
can have spiritual dimensions that we always need to be open to everyone's opinion and let them find truth in their own way.
Well, you have to show openness to my
from the astral realms to the physical plane.
Okay, I'm not going to be browbeating about the head because I don't believe in God, and I'm not going to be told that I can't say something on a show. I never said you couldn't speak about God. That's not what I said. I said it does not help to bring God into politics because God is a purely conceptual entity, has no factual
in the machine,
and
Mondays,
cannot be discussed
10 p.m. Eastern
you can choose
Standard
to believe
Time.
God or not, but
Studio
because
B,
you believe in God,
exclusively
you can say
here
the creator all this stuff.
on
I can provide you with
Revolution
copious evidence
Radio.
on the other side to argue the opposite. But we're never going to find a common ground because if you want to persuade people to believe
Do you or someone you know suffer from poor circulation, shortness of breath, or chest pains? Are you looking for a more natural solution to help overcome these problems? People tell us that after just a few months taking Extendivite, their doctors have noticed unexplainable improvements in their overall health. For more information, visit heartdrop.com or call 1-877-928-8822.
Of evidence, but physical evidence of the world and the life and the creation and the trees and the birds and the animals and all of that stuff that is physically there, and that's the testament to the creator,
the opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com.
You cannot say God exists because the trees and all the creation.
Radio,
that's a circular argument.
Creation.
Creation is a concept. You cannot defend creation by the product of the creation. That's a false.
But it's there, so you have to explain how it got there.
No, I don't.
Well, it didn't just spring up out of darkness. It came to be.
But you're assuming, by your question, you're assuming that there was a creator. And once you assume that, then you're basically shooting yourself in the foot because you have to prove the creator exists.
Yeah. He does. We have to go. We'll have to have this conversation for another time because we're coming back on the program, and it's been an honor to have you, and I appreciate you being there, and I appreciate your patience. But we will be sure to have you on again because I think it's an important subject matter that is deserving of debate. So I appreciate you being there.
Yeah, but don't forget, Mike. God cannot be debated.
This is Scott Bennett. This is Scott Bennett.
Oh, sorry, Scott.
Sorry, Scott.
Yeah. Yes. But the thing is, God cannot be debated because God does not exist to be debated.
God does exist, and I'll just say God is love. God is love. I appreciate you being
God does not exist. I can prove you that God does not exist. Fucking idiot. God does not exist.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. This is Scott Bennett and Michael J. continuing on Shell Games, and we had an interesting conversation with Greg Felton. I appreciate him being there. We were discussing his chapter, Greg Felton, the 9/11 Zionism, Great Feeding Frenzy, The Parasite Eats the Host. And I think he had some very good insights into the Zionization of America and the analysis of Israel and things like that, which are physical evident things. I do disagree with him on his anti-Christian, anti-religion, anti-God notions. I can understand the argument that religious topics discussions can sort of deplete politics. But at the same time, that's sort of another subject. But I don't, and I know you share the same thing, Mike. I don't believe in religion. I don't believe in dogma. I don't believe in the Catholic Church. Right. I don't believe in the Protestant Church. I believe in one name under heaven by which man can be saved. I believe in the creator of the universe. I believe in the creation of the universe, which is not It's not a metaphysical theory. It's not an expression of consciousness like a fart after a big dinner or a burp after a belching beer. The physical creation of the universe are the trees and the animals and the earth and everything in between that was created, and the complexity of life is created. And you can go into all sorts of analytical exercises to try and explain it, and it's easier to
theories.
Personally, I think it's easier to explain life and God and creation than it is to explain it away in an atheistic sense, because there's no background for atheism or things like that. It's like saying, I've heard the argument, you have about as much chance of being created as a human being or living organism as an F-16 fighter plane has of being assembled with a hurricane going through a junkyard. If you believe in accidental evolution and things like that, then you believe in a hurricane. Never mind how a hurricane starts and the complexities of the planet and the solar winds and the distance from the sun and gravity and all that stuff put aside. But if you believe that a hurricane can go through a junkyard and assemble an F-16 riveted with electronic systems and fuel,
time after time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's something else at work in you that's caused a problem. So, I didn't want to go down the road of conflict. I wanted to give him the right to talk about what he wanted, and I recognize, your passions and stuff. But I think he was off base, and I think he's really got some other issues going on. But that being said, I'm going to hand it back to you, Michael J., and let you, explain and smooth that off. He's off the air right now. We're going to bring another guest in momentarily, but before I do, I want to give you a chance to address this. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. But, America has been wounded, and you and I have both experienced the comfort that has been given us by supernatural means. Actually, we've been helped in ways that we can't explain. We've experienced communication and communion with someone who said, he restores my soul. And this can't be faked because, we both know what it's like to be distressed beyond human ability to endure. We both know that. And yet we were helped in ways that superstition or philosophy won't be able to describe. And we've been encouraged in a relationship with someone who has loved us in ways that go beyond human love. So both of us have known forgiveness, and both of us have known compassion and understanding, and we've understood things at a level that goes beyond our ability to intellectually describe or justify. So my feeling is this, that we're here as witnesses, and our witnesses similar and yet very different. My furnace of affliction, many of them were found in the jungles in Vietnam, in 1970-71. I was there. I was drafted. I told the Lord, I don't want to shoot anybody. He told me, pray for your enemies. I did. In 4 different combat units, I've got my records, okay? I can prove every bit of it. But the reality is, I came home without having shot anyone, and it wasn't until later I found out that Vietnam was a false flag, that the Gulf of Tonkin never happened, that the deep state was running things, and that they murdered Kennedy because he was going to pull us out of Vietnam. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. So they did another thing. They called it something like another Pearl Harbor. They planned, as that our former guest said, they planned it from years ahead of time, and they did a good job in planting their explosives and things like that in those 3 buildings. And you and I personally believe they used nuclear weapons in the Twin Towers, because dynamite doesn't turn hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and concrete and glass and porcelain and copper into dust before it hits the ground, okay? And it certainly wasn't jet fuel, that is kerosene, because kerosene can't melt steel, and it certainly can't turn concrete into dust. So this 9/11 truth issue is about 9/11 justice also. We're being encouraged, and we're encouraging each other to pursue the truth in a way where 9/11 begins to make sense because please put your phone on mute, guest. Guest, please put your phone on mute, and we'll invite you in a minute. But the reality is 9/11 truth is an encouragement for people to get up to speed so that you can then understand the necessity, the American duty to actually pursue 9/11 justice.
Yeah.
Okay, brother.
Okay. Yeah, we've got Mark Hightower and we've got Stephen De'ak with us as well. And Mark Hightower was one of the authors who wrote 9/11 Twin Towers Cannot Be Explained by Nanothermite Alone. And Stephen De'ak wrote 9/11 Who Knew What When? The New York City Cover-Up. Both are chapters in the 9/11 Truth Memos that went to President Trump. And Stephen De'ak's chapter is on page 29. And Mark Hightower's is on page 56. So, gentlemen, it's an honor to have you with us. And if there's anything you want to say, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to jump right in and read your works and let you comment on it. Go ahead.
I didn't know I was going to be on video.
You don't. You can turn your camera off. We're on radio.
Okay, good.
Yeah. This is radio only. So,
all right, I'm ready.
All right, Mark, I wanted to jump into your work first and read it quickly. It says, Mr. President, nanothermite, a finely granulated version of thermite, an incendiary long used to weld railroad tracks and to disable artillery using thermite grenades, has been oversold by those who claim that it holds the key to understanding how the Twin Towers were taken down. This thesis, promulgated by the lamestream media as the predominant, if not exclusive, 9/11 truth movement view, is very easy to disprove, thus further confirming that what you call the fake news media is totally complicit in maintaining an official narrative that is false. It is a law of material science that, in order for an explosive to destroy a material, it must have a detonation velocity equal to or greater than the speed of sound in that material. Nanothermite does not satisfy that condition for either concrete or steel, which makes it a non-starter for this role. The speed of sound in concrete is 3,200 meters per second, and in steel, 6,100 meters per second. The highest possible detonation velocity for nanothermite in the scientific literature is only 895 meters per second. 28% of what is required for concrete and 15% of what is required for steel. This means it would not be physically possible for nanothermite to have been responsible for blowing apart the Twin Towers insofar as it cannot blow apart either concrete or steel, the primary constituents. While nanothermite may have been used in an auxiliary role for the purpose of cutting through specific joints and trestles, its explosive force is only 1/13 that of TNT, which is the universal standard. It would have made no sense to use nanothermite in lieu of other more powerful explosives, which is revealed by the estimate of Niels Harrit, a proponent of the nanothermite hypothesis, that it would have taken from 29,000 to 143,000 metric tons of nanothermite for each tower, QED. Other means, not at all investigated by the 9/11 Commission, which appears to have been more of a cover-up commission, were used to achieve the vaporization of the Twin Towers. It remains for you, Mr. President, to fulfill your campaign promise to get to the bottom of this and give us new independent 9/11 investigations on who, why, how, and the costs of the 9/11 atrocity. Very respectfully, Mark Hightower. And Mark's reference is, quote, nanothermite. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. That was Mark Hightower, written in James Fexer's blog, 26/11/2011, and his chapter is on page 56. So we'll start with you, Mr. Hightower, to just let you explain that, and if any new revelations have come to pass with regards to your work. Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to make sure, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah, we're hearing you fine, pal.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me on your show. I was on Jim Fetzer's show back in, I think, it was July 6th, 2011.
Yeah.
And I, a lot of these things I can't remember all these little details off the top of my head, but I did have a presentation that I had that went with that show, and I actually just opened it up on my computer to look at it to refresh my memory of some of these dates and stuff, and I did send it to you as well. But maybe I should start, though, before some of the history. Maybe I should just start by, in my own words, just kind of explaining.
Yeah.
My latest.
Speak to the American people as if they really don't know any of this, and you're sitting around explaining it to a bunch of kids. Hey, look, here's what happened. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's so. There's just so much in the 9/11 truth movement, and in terms of trying to understand, what brought down those buildings, and of course you've got people on one end of the spectrum that they just think it makes sense that planes could have brought them down just from a collision, but then you realize after a while that just doesn't seem to make sense. But there was even somebody in the 9/11 truth movement who initially, this was Michael Rupert, I believe, who he initially was kind of saying he thought that it could have come down just from the planes, So even somebody who's highly respected in many ways for much of their research can even, kind of be off on the wrong track in certain areas. So, and human beings are very easily fooled, including myself. So, but anyway, when I guess, and just to say what I think right now about, nanothermite and so on, and some of the very latest things I've learned, I never really took that hard of a position as far as, saying that I'm absolutely certain that nukes were involved, or that I'm absolutely certain that some kind of directed energy weapon was involved, because those things are kind of beyond my expertise. But I do understand conventional explosives pretty well. Yeah. So I basically just went back and analyzed it as if you were going to do it with conventional explosives. And I calculated out how much that would take if you had explosives at all the different joints and everything. And then based on that rough calculation, you could get an idea of how much explosives you would need. And then you could also you could say, well, if you need this much explosive power, then perhaps it could have been done with the same explosive power, but getting it from some kind of nuke thing. And then something I just recently learned, I won't try to get into too much detail because I can't really say it up, off the top of my head very quickly. Yeah. But there's this fellow Stephen Kelly who wrote a book, Cities Under the Plane, about 5 years ago. I read it 2 years ago, but I'm now reading it, almost done reading it for the second time. But recently saw him present some things about how you can actually have directed energy weapons that are actually powered by nukes, and you can even have powered by a nuke that goes off. Basically, it destroys itself, but at the same time, it produces essentially like a laser effect or a directed energy weapon. So, but anyway,
well, let me jump in. Doesn't all of this sound very, very a very accurate reflection of what we witnessed? I mean, the one good thing about 9/11 is we had some camera angles that were pretty good at capturing the explosion in the building and the fall of the building. Never mind Building 7, never mind the Pentagon, never mind the other building that was next to the Twin Towers as well, where I think gold was stored. But you saw the building fall at free fall speed. That's impossible. You saw an explosion, and they claim it was by a plane, but it seems like that would be impossible, that a plane made of aluminum would crash into a building made of concrete and steel, which is stronger than aluminum, and just simply allow the plane to cut through it like a knife through butter, and then cause this massive explosion, and then projectiles from the building itself exploding out, going hundreds of feet. All of this seemed to be in direct contradiction to the laws of science and explosives that you're a master of. You've got the degree, San Jose State University. I went to San Jose State University, incidentally, for my undergrad in communications. But your scientific explosive background, when you review and examine the explosion in the Twin Towers and the fall of the Twin Tower and all of this, what comes back to mind if you were watching it like a bad movie again? What comes back to say, this right here is physically impossible? This right here, this part of this whole fall or whatever is where their smoking gun, their bloody fingerprints are that we need to look.
Yeah, well, certainly the fact that they came down in essentially free fall, I mean, that's extremely significant. And then even if you had regular explosives situated wherever necessary to bring the building down at free fall, even that would cause a huge amount of dust and everything. But what we saw was even probably way more dust and so on than you would see if you just had, explosives breaking the beams and members and so on, so the building would come down free fall. So there was just a tremendous amount of dust. And then the fact that you don't end up finding much of anything, earlier, I forget who it was, I was hearing somebody recount how, you're not even finding like toilets and stuff that are in the building.
Right.
Just gone.
And you weren't seeing any pancaking either. There weren't whole stories laying at the bottom of the debris. There was just dust.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, maybe I should just give a little history on the nanothermite thing.
Sure.
When I first read that original, I think it was a 2009 paper on nanothermite, and I don't know, I thought it was a good paper initially, but some people were just encouraging me to look a little deeper, and so I did start looking into it and started reviewing things and trying to learn a little bit more about explosives. And then I finally did come to the conclusion that I felt that the way that it was being explained, like by Stephen Jones and so on, where the idea was that, regular thermite, aluminum iron oxide thermite, you get this reaction, it produces a lot of heat and so on. And the idea was that if you get the particles of the aluminum and iron oxide very, very small, down to a nano size, then the reaction can proceed much faster. So if you can get it to proceed faster, the idea was, well, maybe you could have some other molecules as a part of this, organic molecules or whatever, and then the heat would cause those organic molecules to expand, and you'd get kind of like an explosion.
Yeah.
But then, as I started researching the literature to try to find, well, what kind of detonation velocities can you get? And initially I found some extremely low values, and it wasn't until I actually put out some of my challenges, I did this thing called the nanothermite challenge, and then I eventually found probably the highest I could find was at 895 meters per second. And so I guess I was becoming critical that it seemed like Stephen Jones, didn't even really understand much about how explosives work, and he was making an argument that somehow this thermite in a nano form could somehow, actually become a super powerful explosive, which just doesn't make any sense at all. So that's why I went ahead and published some things, and I worked with other people. Jim Fetzer was certainly a part of the group that we were discussing and working on all this stuff. I even had a lot of communications, even via email with Stephen Jones and stuff too, and a lot of the people in the movement. Yeah. So I'm not going to say that nanothermite wasn't used or some kind of thermite.
Yeah.
And I also make the case that if you're going to use thermite, probably regular thermite be better for nanothermite, because nanothermite is going to be reacting, too fast and probably won't achieve the kind of cutting action you really want, because it's going to sort of blow itself all out, and all that hot stuff is just going to not even concentrate and cut the member. So yeah. Anyway, I know I'm going on and on and on, but
it's very valuable, Mr. Hightower, because again, this is to be evidence and testimony before a jury of Americans in the international community eventually, where experts bring their own scientific education and experience to bear and say, for the sake of truth, as well as our American Republic, A massive false flag attack was conducted. The greatest crime in the history of civilization occurred. Thousands of lives allegedly, and the obvious destruction of the Twin Towers and Building 7 occurred for all sorts of reasons. But we have to stick to the science, the physical evidence, and the analysis of the evidence to determine what exactly happened and what didn't happen. The impossibility of the NIST explanation is self-examining when we put it in the light of what you're talking about here, and the thermite and the cuts in the beams and all sorts of things, the pools of metal under the soil. All of these things, when we bring it back on the table as aggregate material and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you're going to hear from these gentlemen who have credentials beyond reproach, and they are telling you the truth in a very succinct way, that the government narrative is impossible. It is scientifically impossible according to the laws of physics and science and architects and thermodynamics and everything, as well as aircraft and all of this other stuff. But it needs to be exposed and prosecuted. So in the last 5 minutes before we go to Mr. De'ak, I want you, Mr. Hightower, in your 5 minutes, what would you say to a jury of Americans to say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to present this in a very simple way for you to understand it. Number one, and let me just set it up. Number one, 9/11 did not occur the way you were told. The government narrative is inaccurate because it is scientifically impossible. And here's what they say happened, but here is what really happened. And I'll let you fill in the blank, Mr. Hightower. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not very good at answering a question like that as far as summarizing, what's exactly the most important thing, because there's just so many different things. I would just, and there's so many different angles on it, but they all converge to the same answer. I guess I would, because my work did relate, to trying to explain the explosive aspects of bringing down the Twin Towers. I guess I would just emphasize that what we saw there was an extremely energetic process that could not have just been the gravitational collapse due to weakening of the members, but the members had to have been taken out by very high energy means such as explosives. And by that, I even say that it could have been nukes and or some sort of nuclear shaped charges or nuclear driven directed energy weapon type effects.
Yeah.
So I would just say that what people see with those buildings coming down and the tremendous dust and the billowing out of all of that dust and going was just so obviously having done with something much more powerful than what the regular news media tried to sell us. And therefore, I would encourage people to just start looking into this and try to get to the truth so that the truth can finally come out, because we need that truth to come out, or the human race is really going to face some really horrible things if we don't get the truth out.
Well, I appreciate you said that, because we're finding ourselves in this very strange Twilight Zone predicament after 9/11. And I was back in just starting my doctorate at 9/11, and I was working at Heritage, and I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I drove by the Pentagon the next day. There was no plane there. There was no tore up grass. There was a big blue tarp. I saw it with my own eyes. So the notion of a plane hitting the Pentagon is absolutely false, fake. It wasn't there. I saw it. There was nothing there except a big blue tarp covering a hole, period. But this whole thing started the greatest, collapse of society and civilization through the juggernaut of an American military adventurism throughout the Middle East. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it in Libya. We've seen it in Syria. For whatever people think of Donald Trump, I applaud the fact that he has said he's going to take us out of Syria and he's going to stop all these wars. I served in the military. I was given a direct commission. I worked at the highest levels of counterterrorism. I didn't discover 9/11 until much, much, much later. And it struck me at the heart when I saw all of this, and it infuriated me beyond words' ability to express that I had served, I had put my life on hold, went into a fight. By the grace of God, I didn't get killed, but I went into a fight for a lie. This entire fabricated fantasy was a lie, and soldiers and people that I know are dead and crippled in vegetable states, all because of this. So it's absolutely essential that your material comes and be brought to the American public, and I think it's going to happen in all sorts of legal actions that are coming. But that being said, I wanted to give the rest of the half hour to also bring in Mr. De'ak and talk about his work and continue this, because what you were bringing up, Mr. Hightower, fits in with Mr. De'ak's work on the World Trade Center. So, Mr. De'ak, you're with us. Let me read what you write real quickly here, because it's very, very good. 9/11, who knew what, when, the New York City cover-up? And I like your quote. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of a time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Frederick Bastiat, who I like very much, wrote The Law, and it's a wonderful book, and it gives you a very clear spiritual, moral, emotional impulse for what the law is all about. And you write, Mr. President, after the World Trade Center opened in 1973, it took less than 20 years for the owners, the Port Authority of New York and the New Jersey Payne NG, to realize that for the sake of the safety of everyone in the area, by 2007, the World Trade Center would need to be dismantled. The decision to privatize the World Trade Center, i.e. to convey that cost and risk to others, was made in 1998. It is highly unlikely that any responsible purchaser, much less an original builder, Larry Silverstein, would be unaware of the fact that the buildings had been condemned. Let me say that again. The buildings had been condemned. Just over 6 months before 9/11, a bid was awarded to Vornado, which appears to have overbid by $600 million. Their conditional bid with demands was rescinded, and the World Trade Center was sold to Larry Silverstein on 26 April 2001, closing on 24 July 2001. It is beyond the realm of possibility to contemplate that everything that needed to be done to bring down all three buildings on 9/11-2001 was done in 47 days. An operation of the size of 9/11 could only have occurred after years of planning. Therefore, a genuine investigation must start at the beginning. The World Trade Center was conceived in the euphoria of the post-World War II years, with negotiations beginning during the Camelot period of the Kennedy administration, a time of growth and optimism. Nonetheless, the project was fiercely fought by local businesses and residents. International trade organizations already had been well-established infrastructure, and international trade accounted for only a small percentage of the gross domestic product anyway, making it a tough sell to convince the city of New York it needed a new World Trade Center. And the legal fight dragged on for years. Eventually, after enough money had traded hands, the Rockefellers and the PANYNJ won the court battles, forcing out all of the small-time businesses and residents in the construction zone. But the public outcry had cost them years and delays, and by then it must have been obvious public support would be tenuous at best. By the time the first jackhammers began rattling the pavement in 1966, the PNJ had overstayed its welcome with the local crowd. And thanks to the war in Vietnam, corruption in Washington, and a slippery economy, the national mood was turning sour too. Since the end of World War II, New York had been in the middle of an historic construction boom, so the World Trade Center must have seemed like a good idea at the time. But as it was nearing completion, the commercial real estate vacancy rates were reaching levels not seen since the Depression, largely blamed on overbuilding during the boom. Corruption is the name of the game in New York construction industry, as it is in every big and little city. Therefore, every construction project is subject to mob control labor, and the World Trade Center was no exception. Every bridge, every building, every tunnel, every airport was built with mob surcharges financed into the project, eventually paid by the public. And I won't continue reading too much there. I want to hand it to you to comment, Mr. De'ak. You give a very clear explanation of the World Trade Center being birthed in corruption, and it seems to have died in corruption. I'll let you fill in the blanks in between. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Hi, Mark, by the way. Good to see you again. Good to talk to you. And thanks, Scott, for having me aboard.
An honor. Go ahead. You're welcome.
Yeah. My research has taken a different turn from other folks. I figured everybody's beaten the horse of the collapses a number of times from a number of different angles. So I focused on the history of the towers and mostly as a way to understand how they were built and what I was looking at in the collapses. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you fine. We hear you fine, pal.
Okay, so I had to understand. I am not an expert at anything. I am a layman, and I attack I believed the official story for years. For example, I believed everything as I was told, all the way down to the box cutters and the scary Arabs.
Yeah.
But examining the history of the World Trade Center, a number of things come to light. I mean, even the architect Yamasaki had deep ties to the defense industry, and his story is fantastic. I don't know if you've ever investigated that. Alone is an amazing story.
No, I haven't.
He was a desperately poor Japanese immigrant who was trying to put himself through school at a time when the country he was in was at war with his native land. So, this is a time when racism was national policy. But he was still allowed to build a naval or design a naval base, and went on to build the consulate in Kobe, Japan after World War II. And so in my opinion, he was a CIA architect. And looking at his history, going past Yamasaki and into the construction of the World Trade Center itself, and just the contractors who were involved, and specifically Colonial Sand and Stone, the Pope family from New Jersey. I don't know if you've heard about the Popes, but these guys are not your average concrete contractors, right? These are the wealthiest Italian immigrant family in the history of Italian immigrant families. They brought us the National Enquirer, and so essentially these guys had contacts to the media, to the CIA, and to the mafia. But I repeat myself. And going on from there, we can go into the history of the World Trade Center being, a modern marvel, where they were advertised as being synonymous with Americana, right? I mean, this is American dream here. Well, that's crap, because there's nothing American about the World Trade Center. There's nothing about apple pie and baseball in corporatism. Just ask Mussolini, which incidentally Mussolini was a person that the Pope family had deep ties with when they were involved with the Pope family was credited with pouring all 10 million square feet of concrete in the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
And so if anybody could get away with being contracted for pouring concrete that never got poured, it would be a family like the Popes. And so that's what I was getting into is none of the official story makes sense at all. I think that's the one thing that the truth movement can agree on. The whole reason the movement is there is that it's BS, that the official story is a lie, and we're trying to answer what really did happen. So when you look into the collapses, and I know that Mark was talking about all that dust, and the dust is a big deal. We have to assume that all of these, that there's a certain of assumption that goes into the investigation, that we assume that the buildings were completed as advertised. Unfortunately, the guys who built the buildings, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the PANYNJ, we'll just call them the Port Authority for brevity. they don't answer to the public. They only answer to two human beings on the planet, and that's the governors of New Jersey and New York. They are steeped in corruption, and they've been making headlines for years now. As far as even the New Yorkers are sick of the corruption, and they basically have a lock on all of the transportation within a 50-mile area around Manhattan, and to me it is an example of what happens when very powerful people have no accountability.
Yeah.
And so, and then you move past that into the history of, when we're talking about, when you started reading the first paragraph, which was discussing how, they were rumored to have been white elephants and terrible, real estate duds, really. And this is corroborated by the history of the real estate market in the area at the time. Like I said, it started in the Camelot years of the Kennedy administration, and everybody was buoyant, and they were we would just kick the Nazis' asses. These guys were probably really flying high. They could do nothing. There was nothing they couldn't do. And so but they didn't need these World Trade Centers. The towers weren't needed. Nobody wanted them. The city didn't want them. And but with all of the marketing, court battles, and the Rockefellers put the pressure on it, they finally got their way. Well, they began building at a time when the economy was taking a plunge. So by the time they completed construction, remember, they've been advertising that these buildings are modern marvels with 50,000 people in them at any given time. But at the time that they were advertising that they were so fully occupied, the rest of the city was reaching vacancy rates not seen since the Depression. There was so much extra space that they couldn't rent. I mean, even the Pan Am building was just built just before the Twin Towers were built. So 10 million new square feet of space was added to a city that was already glutted with space. So we had the point I'm trying to make is that we have to take the World Trade Center, the Port Authority's word that they were built out as they were advertised, and that they were occupied at the levels they were advertised, because they don't answer to the public. That's one of the problems with that agency, is they are a quasi-governmental body that that can seize property through eminent domain, that does not have to answer to the public, that they inspect themselves. I'm pretty sure they don't even have to deal with city fire codes. Even the fire department called those buildings dangerous fire hazards from the moment they were built. There's articles from the New York City, the New York State offices when Rockefeller moved them there, the big anchor tenant that they were hoping to lure other people in. As soon as they got there, auditors realized that they could save the state of New York $2 million a year just by moving out. And so the corruption is just endless when you look at these things. Anyway, that's a long way to say that this all goes. You have ties with the Bush family and the Bin Laden family and Yamasaki, the architect, and the Bin Laden family and the Bin Laden family and the Carlyle Group. This incestuous relationship goes way beyond what the official story has to say.
So this is a long, nightmarish story of corruption dating back to the end of World War II. That's metastasized up through the decades following World War II up until 1998, and then it was prepared, to be crumbled into a cloud of dust. And both insurance policies for terrorism were claimed by Silverstein, who has been reported of meeting Benjamin Netanyahu. I think every Sunday, Netanyahu would call Silverstein, it's been reported. So you see a certain Zionist Israeli connection to this. You see these names you're bringing up in the construction of it. And, you're right. There's a lot of reference to September 11th through a lot of films, popular culture, things like that. It's obvious a great psychological operation was being prepared to be conducted against the American people. And I don't want to get ahead or put anything in your mouth or explain this, but maybe in the 20 minutes we have left, Steve, you can do a fast pace of, if you were presented to the American jury what do you think are the most salient, important points that would make a jury go, oh my God, aha, that's my aha movement. Now I know. Now I see there's something corrupt. Now there's something funny. I don't need to know the details, but I just felt a big gallstone burst in my gut that tells me something is seriously wrong. There's a serious lie. That's all I need to vote guilty. What general feeling can you tell people? Look here, pay attention to this. This is what you need to know. Go ahead.
Well, for me, it's the impact holes at all sites, at all the sites. The damage, the scene of the crime, as it were. If just by examining and that's one of the things I noticed in the truth movement, a lot of effort is spent on the collapses and the dust and even I spent a lot on the corruption, but very few people have examined the impact holes. And I think the damage in the impact holes speak volumes that it kind of actually. Well, first of all, let me also just spit it out and say that we in the truth movement do not have the luxury of believing that of knowing that everybody is being genuine, right? Yeah. The cover up would have been planned at least as much as the event itself, right? So I assume that much of the information that we are given is deliberately planted and designed to direct our attention in one line of investigation or another. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to. I've made a lot of enemies in the truth movement by speaking out, and I'm trying to be as magnanimous as possible when I say this stuff. But I think that the impact holes really need a lot of examination, a very serious examination. People who are from, well, let me go right through. Do you think a plane could make the impact holes? No, I think the impact evidence itself is proof that a plane did not make it. Okay. And so
I think you're right. Now go ahead, because
This is Michael J. What about the impact holes pointed out to you that this was not according to the official story or the NIST report?
Yeah. Well, I started the same place everybody else did. And a lot of the investigation I've done was simply just reading the work of other people like Jim Hightower and or Mark Hightower and Jim Fetzer. But doesn't mean they're right. Doesn't mean I agree with them. But I did read a lot of this stuff, and so you tend to get an idea in your head once you read these things. You start following it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes sense that these things were blown up by explosions. Yeah, I look at the thing. It looks like a classic explosion to me, or a demolition to me, at least Building 7. So I started looking at the damage evidence and saying, well, what did it? What kind of explosions could do this? And then I started realizing no one's even looked at this stuff. And I'm a latecomer. I didn't start until, 2010, before I really started participating. And I didn't want to repave the ground that everybody else has already done. And so I started looking at what places have been not been investigated, and that's the impact holes. And so really, if you look at the first 9 columns from the left of the North and South Tower impact holes, and just compare them, you'll see laterally bent, lightly bent cladding. This is just the aluminum sheeting, very thin aluminum sheeting that went over the steel columns, and that is lightly damaged. Okay, so something not very dense and not very strong hit that aluminum sheeting to lightly damage it and score it. Whatever it was, it became much more dense and much more massive as it traveled to the right and sharply bent steel columns to the right. So right there, those 9 columns and both impact holes, to me, is evidence that it was not caused by the head-on impact of a swept-back wing of a jet, which would have struck the opposite corners. I'd have to explain it with video to explain it. But basically, I would say look at the impact holes at all sites. The Pentagon itself is proof that it wasn't caused by a plane. The impact holes at the World Trade Center, proof enough, no plane caused that damage, and Shanksville as well. And then when you look at the impact damage, you can pretty much surmise what could have. There are very few things that could have done it. And my work, I won't be shy about it. I conclude that it could only have been caused by numerous missile strikes, small missiles. I know it, and again, kind of a pariah with the truth movement on this one because I'm the only one waving the missile flag out there.
Well,
that's what I would do.
I'm glad you are. I'm glad you are because people have said that before. Mike Harris has said he suspected it was a missile from a Dolphin-class Israeli submarine in the Potomac, and that's possible. I don't look at anything like this with ego. I don't look at it with any personality or investment. I look at it as Michael J. looks at it, and I think you do too. I look at it as an officer of the United States Army who swore to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I've just discovered that the government and various entities have lied and corrupted and created this fantasy, and we're trying to work backwards looking at the evidence and the science to find out where are the broad strokes, what is absolutely physically impossible, where do we know, because the science and the evidence will lead us back to really prove beyond a shadow of doubt that this government narrative is physically impossible. So anything is automatically on the table, and anyone that tries to guilt trip you or shut you down or call you a name or say you're a Grinch or any of this crap is a liar or a fool, because we are humbly searching for the truth, and we welcome every man and woman who present their ideas, their theories, their suppositions. Nothing is taboo. Everything is on the table, because only then can we sift it. Go ahead.
I would think so too. I agree completely. I would think that okay, if any idea is irrelevant and not valid, then the evidence will explain that. So that's basically, if you want the smoking gun, look at the impact holes of all three sites. And I've been doing some experiments with particularly the Shanksville site because, I don't know, I was a red-blooded American male. I grew up heavily armed and blowing stuff up. And so I recognized in that hole in the ground at Shanksville, the holes I used to make as a kid shooting stuff and blowing things up with fireworks and explosives, legal and otherwise. And so I've been trying to, I'm going to, hopefully this year, I will get a slow motion video camera and reproduce the Shanksville crater it can be reproduced with a couple projectiles and an explosive. Striking at trajectories of less than 10 degrees from horizontal, it's reproducible every time. So to me, that means missiles.
Brother, I was a loadmaster on C-58 Galaxy aircraft. And I know for a fact, because they're just big aluminum tubes, especially that, because it was a cargo aircraft and most of the inside was empty, except for when we were carrying stuff. But the reality is that's the basic design for all passenger aircraft. The insides, except for the fuel tanks and things like that. You've got floors in there, but just floors to support the seats and things like that. But most everything is super light because planes can have economic, viability because they're light. But the reality is that there is no way that a plane could enter with the nose cone being made of nylon or plastic or whatever, because it hides the radome for radar, detecting what's out in front of you. The reality is there's no way that a plane made out of aluminum could disappear inside of a building designed to, withstand the impact of heavier aircraft. By the way, they're using much thinner materials now than they were, when the building was designed to handle previous aircraft, which were made of much heavier, by the way. They were not. Yeah,
that was a 707, I think, right?
Exactly, yes. So the reality for me is this. The wings would have sheared off. The fuel would have spent itself along the face of the building as it poured downwards. The plane's engines would have impacted and then dropped to the ground. But they did find, according to Judy Wood, a jet engine on the ground. It was still on a skid pallet that they had used to push it off the back of a truck. But the reality was from the wrong kind of jet. So I'm looking at the fact that this is a lie, but our job right now is not only explaining how planes couldn't do it or what kinds of explosives could do it, but our reality right now is doing what we can to educate the American people to bring them up to speed, because the immensity, the enormity, the dimensions of deception that have been projected and promoted by the deep state and their control of the media has got a lot of people still, they don't even think about it. They think they know the truth. What do you think?
Oh, I think that that the veneer is fading pretty well. I mean, I think most people are in denial. Like my whole family, they're very smart people with upper level degrees, lawyers, doctors, psychologists, journalists, and they all think I'm totally off the board. But the thing is that they won't even look at the evidence that leads me to my conclusions. That's the hardest part, is just to get people to look at it. And when you have, the 2-minute sound bites that we're so used to hearing, that, our attention spans are so low now that you got to get it out in 10 minutes. Well, this is a freaking fantastic story. I can't wait to write a book about it. It's not a story you can spit out in 10 minutes. It takes freaking volumes.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the genius of it all is, and I think this goes far, far greater than just Israel and just the United States. Any nation that's not calling BS to the concept that a plane can burrow into the ground, slice through steel, and bore through steel or brick and concrete buildings, and then vanish into thin air is at fault. Anyone that's not calling BS to the war on terror is part of the problem. And so I think that we're dealing with a level of people at the, who run the countries that collude between themselves, and that we are never going to be privy to. So I think we need to bypass that and reach our brainwashed, slumbering neighbors, unfortunately, who think that this is the new normal. It's not. This can't be. This can't be the new world we're in.
Yeah,
but the psychology they used against us created what Judy Wood called initially the cognitive dissonance, because people don't want to believe that our nation was capable of this kind of evil.
Oh, yeah, and I agree. I bought it, too. It's a lot easier to live that lie than it is, because, look at what you face once you speak it. Once you really swallow what you've seen, and you realize that this is a lie, suddenly you question everything. Now you don't know who to, and then if you start speaking out about it, then you're ostracized as a nut, by your friends and family. Now you don't even have any friends and family to want to talk to you. Who would want to put themselves through that? It's a brilliant scheme. I think Gerard Holmgren had it nailed when he said it was a scheme to make the whole world crazy.
Well, that's not far from the truth in my gut instincts, and we're getting close to the end, and I just wanted to thank you before we go, and I just say, as someone who swore an oath and became an officer, I was given a direct commission, and I was in the Air Force Cadets when I was a kid, and all this, my family was military. I have to say, I think the solution has to rest in both prosecuting the military, first and foremost, who played a part in this, and the failures, and awakening those who wear the uniform now. We have a duty as soldiers who swore an oath to defend our people, our Constitution. If it is not the military who will stand up and expose this and attack this, then we have no hope. Because the military, yes, they are citizen patriots, but the military are wearing the uniform for a reason. If you've had the balls
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of this program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information
I feel
never
encouraged
sleeps.
because I think I do see so many things coming together just from many different angles, where I think that there is, a very big awakening taking place in America, but I think even in the whole world. And so I'm very hopeful that there is going to be
Thanks for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we are listener-sponsored and commercial-free, but there still are bills to pay. In order to raise some needed funds to cover the cost, our station is offering a silver special. In the continental United States for a $60 donation, or in Alaska, Hawaii, or Canada for a $70 donation, we will send you an uncirculated 2018 1-ounce pure silver Eagle. The $70 donation, the extra 10 is to cover shipping, by the way, outside of the continental United States. When making the donation, you must put Silver Eagle promo in the notes on the donation. And thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at revolution.radio and freedomslips.com. Without you, there is no us. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Take a look around, kid. What do you see? Homes being foreclosed. People working 2-3 jobs just to put food on the table and still drowning in debt. Don't get me wrong. This country was founded on great ideals and principles. They've all been ruined by the banks. Open your eyes to the banks that are robbing you. You know who my favorite president was? Who? Thomas Jefferson. Because he saw all of this coming and tried to stop it. He fought the banks. JFK too, and they killed him for it. The banking institution is more dangerous than an army, he said. He also said that every generation needs a revolution, Jimmy. The American dream is just that. Just a dream. War is a continuation of politics, only by other means. Politics is a continuation of economics by other means. This is our bank. This is our war.